Chapter 10, Motivating Employees. About 100 years ago, a man named Elton Mayo started looking into the scientific aspects of management, which we talked about a little bit in Chapter 9. Mayo took a look at the company named Hawthorne that owned the Western Electric Company in Illinois, and the plant here you see on the first slide. He was taking a look at what was going on there to try and figure out how companies put their employees to work, how they expected them to do the tasks that they were assigned, and whether or not they were successful. More importantly, he wanted to study to find out how they could improve the processes that they're using. You have to really diagnose if there's an issue and then come up with potential solutions to try to fix it. It may be that the way the company was operating was based on assumptions that were not scientifically vetted, meaning it was more of an opinion about what managers thought they needed to do rather than what would really be effective. It's called the Hawthorne effect because, as noted, the Western Electric Company is called the Hawthorne Works. The idea is relating to all types of psychology and all types of science. When people know that they're being studied, they do change their behavior somewhat when they know that they're being observed. So that was another thing that came out of it. It's not the main point for this class, but it's an interesting sidebar. So in the 1920s, Mayo went out to the Western Electric plant. He looked at Taylor's work that we discussed in Chapter 9, and rather than saying that man is the one that does everything, man is a machine, he said that their employees' performance is influenced by a lot of different things, including their ability, their skill, the resources made available to them, and actually how they're treated at the job. He wanted to take a look at the physical conditions on worker productivity, but during his investigation, he found that workers really responded well to attention from their managers. If the managers interacted with them on a human level, if they acted empathetically, and they were jointly concerned about being productive, then they could work together as opposed to just being told what to do out of fear of losing their job. So at the end of his research, he concluded that the employees tended to work harder not because they were being threatened, but because they felt that they belonged to the company and they had a sense of being and a sense of value for having that job. So looking at the findings that came from this, researchers hypothesized, which means they presented an idea that would have to be vetted out through research and eventually become a theory. In science, a theory is pretty close to being fact. A hypothesis is just what we usually would call a theory in regular layman's terms in day-to-day life. But they came up with a hypothesis that if workers had the ability to choose who they worked with, working in a group, being treated well, having a sympathetic supervisor, that might be what's causing productivity to increase in certain places and in not others. What the studies found is that work performance is dependent on social issues and job satisfaction more than what the traditional views of management may have been, or threats of losing their job, or the carrot and stick portion of salary and benefits being awarded to people when they perform. Much to the shock of the traditionalists, they kind of came up with the idea that just as important as having a job, I mean, nobody's going to say, I don't care how much money somebody's paying me, I don't want to lose my job. A lot of people have worked bad jobs for a long time because they need to pay rent. But equally important, besides the threat of losing your job and being dictated to by management, it really does have social factors that are important. The way that you feel as part of the community where you work, that can give you a greater incentive to perform at a high level because when you have bonds with the coworkers, you don't want to let them down. This led to this whole point about need-based theories. What do employees need? If you can meet the needs that they're looking for and satisfy them, then they will likely be satisfied with the job. And if you have satisfied employees, the theory would go, or the hypothesis would go, that they would perform better. They would be more motivated to perform at a high level, which would be beneficial to everyone involved, particularly the investors who are looking for a return on their investment. So the examples of need-based theories that we're going to go over, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you will probably hear multiple times as you go through your life and through studies. It's going to come up in other courses as well as psychology courses. The ERG theory, Hertzberg's two-factor theory, and McClelland's acquired needs theory. I'm not necessarily going to test you about maybe Maslow because it's so well known, but I'm not going to quiz you on the names of these people who had done this historical work. But you need to know what these theories means and what they came up with because they are applied in business on a regular basis. Maslow's hierarchy of needs was created by Abraham Maslow, who's a psychologist, and he basically came up with the idea that human psychological and physiological needs can be represented on a pyramid. The things at the base of the pyramid are the most important basic things that you need, and as you move up to the higher levels, You get away from the core elements that you need, but there's still things that are important to people. And managers can use the hierarchy pyramid to try and understand how to improve productivity and satisfaction among employees. So here's the pyramid. At the basic level, you have physiological needs. These are your physical needs: food, water, shelter, be protected, have heat in the winter, cooling in the summer. The next step up from that is once those are satisfied, you're going to be looking for security to make sure that you can retain the physiological needs that you've got. You also want to have a job. You also want to create assets to be able to rely on if you need money. And if you happen to lose your job, you want to have money set aside. So security is anything that you can do to make yourself feel more secure. Then you have social needs. You've got family, friendships, intimacy, feelings of belonging. Not to say that you can't have family and friendships without employment, or maybe even if you were homeless, but this is basically structured in a way that you're looking at the things that everybody needs. And it's not necessarily less or more important, but you can't really focus on friendships and intimacy and a sense of belonging if you can't put food on your table or have a place to go home to at night. The next level up is esteem, which includes self-worth, accomplishment, and confidence. And then the final thing at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization, which is where you get inner fulfillment. You get to pursue the things that are important to you at a higher level. If you want to go to an art museum, whatever it may be, things that are above and beyond the typical bread and butter types of needs that people have. You're never going to get to the top of the pyramid if you have those things underneath that are not being provided. So if you have employees that are working for you and they're not feeling secure because they're not sure if their job's going to be there or if their boss is going to fire them, then the rest of the pyramid can be kind of problematic. That can also lead to problems with the higher steps. So it's very often that people who have employment issues then have stress in their lives, and that can cause stress on their family, which makes it difficult for them to achieve those other parts of the pyramid. They can go up and down here a little bit too. So you could also have family problems that could impact your ability to work. So all of these things kind of need to be taken as a whole. I'm not saying that one thing is more important than the other, but obviously the things at the bottom are really necessary in order for the rest of them to fall into place. The implications of Maslow's theory: he's basically saying where it used to be believed that people work primarily for money in order to get their needs elsewhere, others do have the ability or the need to meet these higher order needs at work as well. So if an employee works hard for a promotion and doesn't get it, they may have less motivation, they may not think it's worth it to work hard, and they could put in less effort. If you don't have job security, you're going to be more concerned about making money and being able to pay for your family and all the things that you need instead of getting esteem at work. So keeping your employees motivated can be kind of a moving target. As I mentioned before, it may be different parts of that pyramid could affect other parts as well. The ERG theory: ERG is an initialism for existence, relatedness, and growth. Aldifer modified Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory and came up with this concept. So existence is the basic material requirements for living. That's the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. Relatedness has to do with the importance of maintaining interpersonal relationships. So if you're talking about family and friends, that can lead to self-worth and other things that Maslow was talking about. And then growth is a general idea to describe your intrinsic desire, your internal need for personal development. Most people want to fulfill themselves as much as possible, and if they can't get that through work, it's going to make them less satisfied in their life. If they're less satisfied in life, they won't be potentially working quite as well as they should be. So the proposition here is that if you have one category of needs that isn't being met, people will try to redouble their efforts in order to fulfill their needs in a lower category. So that could have a reaction that could be predictable if you're a manager in some sense. Hertzberg had a two-factor theory. All of these are basically taking bites out of the same apple. They're just looking at this issue and looking at it with a slightly different spin on it. So Hertzberg was also a psychologist. He wanted to look at the effect that attitude has on motivation. He asked people who were participating in the study to describe when they felt good and when they felt bad about their jobs. And then he could look at their answers to find out if there was any commonality between them. On the basis of that research, he hypothesized that there are two sets of factors that can govern job satisfaction and dissatisfaction. The first is hygiene, and the second is motivation. Hygiene factors, which we'll talk about in a second on the next slide, that's an extrinsic motivator. So extrinsic usually means external, it's from the outside. And motivation factors are usually internal. You get motivation from yourself. You may be provided motivation from others, but really what they're doing is triggering the motivation from within yourself. When we say hygiene, we're not talking about hygiene in the sense of going home and taking a shower, although it's based on a similar concept of the term. Hygiene is really a condition or practices that relate to maintaining health, preventing disease. So in this context, hygiene as it pertains to work is a similar concept, but it's not like personal hygiene. Just want to make sure that was clear. The hygiene factors at work are things that are basic needs. You got to get security, pay, fairness, the working conditions. You look at your salary and benefits, the amount of control the employer has over keeping your position filled, whether or not you're going to have a job next week or next year. The work environment, whether it's a bad culture or a good culture. Is it a pleasant place to work? What type of policies do they have? How is your boss? What kind of reputation does the company have? These are all the things that are external factors that are outside of the control of the individual a large degree. You may be able to have some impact on the hygiene factors at work, but it really is an external factor that you're being exposed to at work. And it can have an impact on how you process information and respond through your effort at work. So while the hygiene factors are expected by most people, they don't really increase motivation, but if you don't get them, they will cause dissatisfaction. So for example, if I'm at work, I expect my work to have a safe, heated or air-conditioned place to work, a place with a comfortable chair, a place with computer access, filing systems, bosses, people who work in a normal way. These are things that people expect. So the idea of hygiene isn't really that you need to focus on the hygiene to make people motivated. It usually looks to be that if you don't get the things that are expected, then that can demotivate you and decrease your satisfaction. And when people are not satisfied at work, they tend to not work as productively. Motivation factors are intrinsic. They want to make sure that employees have challenging work, something that will keep them interested, whether or not they have growth potential. Those can be an additional source of motivation, but they're really internal because it's the things that are affecting how motivated you are to do something. And the motivation truly does come from within. People can demotivate you or they can give you a rousing speech or something to get you excited about it. But if you're not motivated to do anything, there's not much a lot of other people are going to be able to do to talk to you in order to get you motivated to do something. So we have higher levels of satisfaction if management looks at the motivation factors. Hopefully they're taking care of the hygiene issues as they should. And if you meet the minimum requirements, that'll be fine. But the motivation factors is how you get change in employee behavior that would be more for the positive. And looking to decrease dissatisfaction, you have to focus on the hygiene factors to make sure that they're being done okay, because that will have an impact on the intrinsic factors later for motivation. So if you have a heating system that doesn't work, if it's a miserable place to work, you may want to look at improving that. Because if you meet at least the basic expectations for people, that'll go a long way in making sure that they remain motivated when they come to the office. McClelland is yet another person who's involved in management science. He came up with something called the acquired needs theory. It splits the needs of employees into three categories. If you are a person who is strongly achievement motivated or oriented, you're going to be driven by the internal desire to do your job well. Other employees who are affiliation motivated, they're driven by the desire to make good social relationships. And other employees who are power motivated, they want to influence, teach, or encourage others. Again, I've said this before, nobody ever falls into one of these categories. There's going to be maybe a preference for certain employees. Most people have all three. If you are the type of person that only has a strong motivation to be driven by the desire to master your work, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of friends and people will think you're a little bit weird. So most people have at least some combination of these things, but he is looking at them as three distinct issues that management can look at so that they can ensure that the workplace is set up in a way that people will respond to them in a positive fashion. Based on the acquired needs theory, when you figure out that people are motivated by all of those needs to varying degrees and proportions, then how you balance those needs are your kind of profile. So out of those three, maybe you are a preference for number one, maybe two and three are kind of split, maybe a different person is really focused on number three. All three are present, but if you're a manager and you're trying to figure out what makes your employees tick, this is a structured way to be able to look at it. So if somebody is really driven by getting a promotion, a manager could really help work with them and encourage them to find out how they're going to master their work, how they're going to be able to rise up in the organization. And if they have the capability, that would show that management is paying attention to them. You would really start to tick off that box of what keeps that person satisfied. If that's what really drives someone to do work, if that can be fulfilled because the manager recognizes it, then they're going to be a happier, more satisfied employee. Process-based theories look at motivation as a rational process, that people who are going to be motivated are doing so because a rational, reasonable person would be motivated in a certain situation. With a different set of facts, a rational, reasonable person might not be motivated. People look at their environment, they figure out how they're going to respond to something, whether they like what they see, whether they don't. And the way that they respond can sometimes be fairly predictable. And the three best known process based theories are equity theory, expectancy theory, and reinforcement theory. The equity theory is basically stating that people expect to be treated fairly. Equity in this sense is not in the equity sense that we were talking about before in business, which largely means ownership. Equity in this context means fairness, being treated equally. So if I'm doing a job and I'm getting paid $50,000 a year and my colleagues are doing the same work, maybe even a little less well as I'm doing it, and they're making $65,000 a year, I'm going to notice that at some point. I'm going to find out about it. People talk, they may get access to that information. So you look at the inputs that you put in, how much am I working, and what am I getting out of it? How much am I being paid? If that scale looks like I'm putting in more than I'm getting out, then I'm going to have a feeling that I'm not being treated fairly, and there will be some inequity in the workplace. And if I think I'm being treated inequitably, then that's going to have an effect on my satisfaction, and that can be tied directly to my motivation to perform well at work. I may start to pull back if I think that there's no reason for me to work hard because other people are doing the same job and being paid more. Why should I bend over backwards to do extra? So the inputs are the things that the employee puts in, the work that you spend, the time that you spend working, the amount of effort that you have, the ideas that you come up with, working with your colleagues, etc. The outputs are what you get from the employer, and these can be either tangible in the form of salary or intangible in the form of job security, enjoyment of the job, praise, etc. So if I'm putting in a lot, I would hope that my outputs would meet what I expect. One of the difficulties with this and other similar theories is that most of this is subjective. We talked previously about the difference between objective and subjective. Objective is fact-based, subjective is opinion-based, and everybody has their own opinion. I could think that I'm valued at $100,000 a year. My boss may not think so, but it's subjective, and it's hard to convince someone otherwise if they're already convinced of something personally. If something is important to them, it really depends on the person themselves. So it can be somewhat difficult and a kind of a barrier to working with some people, depending on how married they are to their perceptions of inputs and outputs. But I've worked with people that I'm sure would never feel like they were being treated fairly. It's just their nature. They could be the highest paid person, they could get all the accolades, and they could still complain because they don't think they're being treated fairly when compared to their colleagues. The ideas that come from equity theory is that individuals will usually try to do things that would maximize their outcomes. They want to get the most pay, they want to get the most recognition, they want to get the most enjoyment out of the job that they can. When they're in inequitable relationships, they become dissatisfied. I don't know if distressed is a proper term, but they may not be particularly thrilled to work there. And if you have a group of disgruntled, unhappy workers, it's going to come out in the amount of output that they're able to put forth. So how do you use equity theory as a manager? Employees really do look at the measure of their inputs and outputs. Employees do pay attention to their inputs and their perceived outcomes that they're getting and whether or not they're equitable. They will put their individual values to inputs and outputs. So if I'm not getting what I think, it could have kind of a self-esteem issue as a result. If I'm working my hardest and I'm not getting what I think I deserve, then I'm going to start asking questions why, and that could be a blow to your self-esteem as well. Why are my colleagues making money and I'm not? Why doesn't my boss like me? That type of thing can come from an inequitable situation. One thing that is mentioned here is executive pay. I will try to put a link from a class that I use at Northeastern regarding CEO pay. 50 years ago, it wasn't that unusual for CEOs to make 30, 40, or even 50 times what your regular employee would make. Today, CEO pay has really, really exploded, and some of the bigger CEOs are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Some have been targeted and calculated to be making between 1,500 and 2,000 times what the average employee that works for them makes. If somebody makes 2,000 times as much as you would have to work for 2,000 years just to make the amount of money that this person made in 1 year. Now, if you're working for a company and you're not particularly thrilled with it, and you know that the CEO is making $40 million a year, and you're making $40,000 a year, 1/1000th of what the CEO is making, yeah, the CEO is probably pretty skilled, but are they 1,000 times better? Are they 1,000 times more deserving of that salary than you are? The answer most people will come up with is probably not. So that has become something that's more publicized because of a change in the law about 10 years ago. Companies have to report what their CEO pay is because a lot of them were kind of doing it in secret. The federal government does require this information to come out, and it has had somewhat of an impact on how much CEOs are making, but not a whole lot. People are more aware of it and they are complaining more about it. So that is something to pay attention to as we move forward. The expectancy theory is very closely related to most of the other things that we're talking about. Most people have an expectation. In the case of the hygiene, you expect things to be pretty good at the office, that the lights will go on when you turn on the switch, that type of thing. So whatever level of expectancy you have, that's probably, hopefully, going to be a reasonable thing. And it's your individual belief that if you expend enough effort, you will get what you are expecting to receive as an output or an outcome. So their expectancy is judged by two things. One is instrumentality, that is whether or not you believe that you will get the outcome if you do the work, and valence, which is the value, similar word, related to what the individual places on a particular outcome. So instrumentality, if I work hard, I'll get a promotion or I'll get a raise. And the valence is the amount of value that I put on that particular outcome. If I expect something, if I work hard and I don't get what I expect, I'm not getting something that satisfies my value proposition, then that's going to lead to disappointment. The expectancy theory basically tells managers that it's a way for you to help understand how people are motivated. And if you fail to meet their expectations, that could have negative consequences. If you have clear policies in place, then expectations can be managed a little bit more. If I tell you exactly how long you have to work in the job and what type of training and everything that is expected of you, then you have a clear path of what you need to do. If I never tell you anything, then you're basically guessing and hoping that the work that you did was good enough to get the reward that you're seeking. If I spell everything out on a policy, then that helps set the expectations a little bit better. The caveat here is that if I do that, I need to come through. If people do meet all of that criteria that I've already established and I don't reward them for it, then they're going to have a failure of this expectancy theory. It's not going to meet their expectations. So if you're going to create these policies, that's a good start, but you have to apply them and make sure that they're enforced correctly. Managers should focus on making sure that whatever rewards you're giving to people are tied to performance and that you're measuring the correct things in the performance. So we mentioned that a little bit earlier with Chapter 9 in management. The other thing I also mentioned in the previous slide is one employee may find certain things to be motivating, but another employee may not care at all. If you've ever gone to a place that has a picture of the employee of the month up on the wall, some people will find that very motivating. They want to be getting that recognition. Other people could not care less if their picture was up on the wall. They have other things that motivate them. So your employees are all individuals and they'll have subjective takes on what is fair and what is not fair and what they may expect or don't expect. It's difficult, and that's why managers have to spend some time trying to figure out how these people think and what makes them tick. One way to convey the information about what the expectations should be is to train your staff and let them know what they are, but also to give them better tools so that they can achieve what they're trying to do. If they don't have the proper training or the proper resources, the proper equipment, enough time to do what you're asking them to do, they're never going to be able to achieve what is expected of them. And that would be perceived by them as a failure, and eventually they would perceive it as an inequitable outcome. Reinforcement theory is essentially a fancy way to say carrot and stick. People will work for money, so if you want them to do work, you pay them money. If you want them to do better work, you could pay them more money. It's a much more transactional way of looking at it than the modern theories regarding management involve. Here's a chart that shows the operant conditioning figure. Conditioning is what happens when a subject receives certain stimuli for various behavior. It goes back even to Pavlov's dog. We don't want to talk about that in the context of workers, but Pavlov's experiment was he had a dog, he'd ring a bell and give the dog food. That was the conditioning. Every time you heard the bell, the dog got fed. Then he rang the bell and the dog started to drool in anticipation that the food was coming. So that dog had been conditioned to that response. Your people that are working for you are not dogs, but we are mammals and we do respond to certain things. Operant conditioning can be addressed in two ways. You can do reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement is basically trying to increase behavior. Punishment is a selection that you would make if you're trying to decrease behavior. Under punishment, you can see that they have positive and negative consequences. So the positive is to add something noxious or something unpleasant to encourage people to not repeat that type of behavior. Negative is to remove the appetitive which is related to the word appetite, something that is a desirable behavior or something that you want to do, in order to prevent them from continuing to do so. So the example that they gave is telling a child to go to his room. What you're doing is you're taking away whatever stimulus they were exposed to get the behavior that you didn't want to have and that you thought necessitated punishment. So anytime you have a positive, that's the presence of a stimulus, or to add a stimulus. The negative is to remove or not have a stimulus. Reinforcement, as stated, increases behavior. Punishment decreases behavior. Escape, which is noted at the bottom of that little chart, it removes a stimulus as well. So the example they gave is to hit the snooze button on your alarm clock. The alarm is annoying you. And then avoidance is studying to avoid a bad grade. I suppose the other example of the alarm clock would be to not set the alarm, but that probably wouldn't work out particularly well. So in a business context, positive reinforcement is when you reward someone because they did behavior that they were supposed to be doing or that you desired that they do. So if you come up with an employee who has a new idea and we give her a bonus because we ended up making more money, that's a reward because we want this person to keep doing that type of behavior. In negative reinforcement, you take away the stimulus that a person doesn't like in response to the desired behavior. So in the example that they give, somebody does a few projects better than expected. Rather than giving them something positive, which is adding something like a bonus, you're taking away a thing that could be potentially problematic, which is a long commute. So as a reward, you take away something that they would otherwise have to do. So that would be negative reinforcement to, again, encourage this person to do what you want them to. Factors affecting reinforcement include satiation. To be satiated is to be full. So if you're thirsty or you're hungry and you want to be satiated, you want to eat or drink. So it's the degree of need. It's the way to measure it. How much does somebody want something? How much of an impact will it have? The immediacy of reinforcement is important because oftentimes if you reward somebody long after the fact, then there's not really going to be that direct connection. Somebody does a good job and you pat them on the back and say, hey, good job. They understand that there's a direct nexus between the two. The quicker you are able to give a reinforcement, the better results will be. Size refers to the magnitude of the reward or conversely, the punishment that could have a big effect on the response. For punishment, positive punishment is providing an adverse stimulus, meaning that you're doing something in terms of positive. It's not necessarily positive in that someone wants that. So the example is to suspend somebody for inappropriate behavior. You're taking an action in order to send the message that that behavior is not appropriate. Negative punishment is to remove or to withhold something that they would want in response to undesirable behavior. So instead of suspending them and taking an active positive punishment, the employee in this example isn't doing a particularly good job. They wanted to have these flex hours of 10:30 to 7. You could pull that away from them. One of the things about flex time is some places do allow you to come in at varying hours, but that's always at the option of the boss. And it's something that you earn. It's not something that's necessarily a right as an employee. So the negative punishment is to take away something that they wanted to do in order to get the message across that they shouldn't be performing in that manner. The whole point of punishment is to provide a deterrence to help avoid behaviors that we don't want. Effective punishment and consistent punishment, as well as fair punishment, meaning that everybody is treated the same so that there's no issues of equity that could be underlying this. If the employees know what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do, and they see the example of other people being punished, then they'll know that this is something that there's a precedent for. And if you behave in a particular way, you should be aware that you're probably going to face some type of punishment. So that can give an incentive to not behave that way. Even if they're never punished, but their colleagues are, it is kind of an expansion. It creates this incentive for them to not behave in a manner that's not desirable. Preemptive education, telling people what the rules are, what the expectations are, and what the potential consequences are another way to set that example, to let them know what the situation is. If you can avoid having a problem arise, it's always better. I always told my classes as a lawyer, it's always better to not get sued than it is to have to go to a lawsuit. The way you avoid that is to make sure that your contracts are clear, there's no problems with what you're doing, everybody is in agreement beforehand. That's not going to be a guarantee that there won't be any problems, but it can really reduce the amount of problems that could come from it. If you can prevent bad behavior by establishing clear guidance to all of the employees, then hopefully they will comply with it and you will avoid the problem before it actually happens. In management, there's a few different things that we look at. These are popularized as Theory X, Theory Y, and Theory Z. These are essentially preconceptions that managers may have about behaviors of employees. And what we try to do is categorize people, again, just like anything else that we've talked about, Nobody is going to be strictly under theory X, Y, or Z, but these are behaviors that have been observed over time. McGregor, another one of these people that we've been looking at, theorized that worker motivation is really linked to the way the managers view and treat the workers. So you can fall into theory X and theory Y in terms of the managers. William Uchi combined Eastern and Western management practices to come up with theory Z, so we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. Theory X managers make some assumptions. They believe, and this is relatively old-fashioned and falls under the classical construct of management, they believe that most people don't like work and that they will try to avoid it, that they'll shirk their responsibilities. Most people are not ambitious, they don't want the responsibility, and they actually want to be directed. Again, the assumption here is that most people don't want to do things. They don't really have a lot of creativity. They're not interested in solving problems for the organization. And motivation really only comes at the physiological and security levels at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. So as long as we're providing you a paycheck, that's what you're going to do. And we're going to tell you what to do because we assume that you don't like work. And if we don't get on you to do the work properly, you won't do it. It also assumes that people are self-centered, so that they will only be doing things to benefit themselves rather than the organization. So you have to monitor what they're doing very closely. And the other thing is that most people are resistant to change, as well as being gullible and not particularly smart. Now, some of these assumptions may apply to individual employees, but to make a blanket assumption and stereotype everybody, and then treat everybody as if all of these things were true about all of your employees would obviously be kind of a problem. People do resist change, but only when change is presented to them in the abstract or out of the blue. When change is thrust upon them and they didn't know it was coming, they tend to react fearfully. But if you know that change is coming and you address it and you tell your employees why the change is happening, how it's going to play out, they're always a lot easier to get them to agree to the change or at least understand how to behave while the change is taking place. If people are resistant to change, you could make the contrary argument that it's because the management failed to do their job correctly. And to assume that everybody's gullible and unintelligent, you're probably hiring the wrong people if that's the case. Motivation under theory X, it relies on coercion, threats, micromanagement, which is something that most people can't stand. If somebody's looking over your shoulder telling you how to put your paper clips away or how to answer the phone and the tone of your voice, every little thing that you do, it can become very much of an interference with your ability to do the job. People often respond negatively to this type of management. They can result in hostility. They don't want to really work hard. And if they happen to be in a union house where all of the employees negotiate through the union, it could result in some type of grievance procedures and contract changes through the union negotiations. The soft approach is something where you're trying to get harmony in return for cooperation, but under Theory X, it's seen as a way for diminished work output. People will want more and put out less. The insights from Theory X is that McGregor basically says they're all incorrect. So as you were hearing these, you could probably figure out that maybe it doesn't apply in the real world for everyone. According to McGregor, when you have a need and you satisfy it, it no longer motivates. So if I have a need to get money to pay the rent and I'm going to work and all I'm getting out of it is a paycheck, once I get the paycheck, I have no incentive to do anything more. I'm not motivated to go above and beyond what the minimum requirements are. So once I get the monetary rewards and whatever benefits I get, the motivation goes away because I've already got what I need. Theory X management is alleged to hinder satisfaction of the higher level needs in the Maslow pyramid because it doesn't even acknowledge that they exist or that they're relevant in the workplace. So if you're not going to let people move up on their pyramid of self-actualization at the end of the run, then they're not going to be happy with their work. So under Theory Y, which is a more modern view of the Theory X paradigm, employees are motivated by higher level needs of esteem and self-actualization. This is up the higher end of the pyramid for Maslow. Work can be seen as natural as play, that people want to be self-directed, they want to do their own things, they want to be creative, and they can meet their own objectives if they're committed to them. So it's not necessarily forcing people to do things, it's to give them the tools to be able to do it. And if you hire the right people who are already motivated, they're going to want to do a good job. People can be committed to the quality and productivity, such as self-fulfillment, because they know that there's an exchange going on here, that they're a partner with the employee rather than simply a cog in the machine. And the other assumption here is that people can handle responsibility because creativity and ingenuity are common. Everybody comes up with pretty unique ideas on the job or in their personal life. And if you just assume that nobody's going to be able to come with anything of value, you're not going to get anything of value. If you have your eye open for people when they submit information or they give you ideas, then you can take advantage of it and potentially make the company a better place to be in a more productive environment. The implications into theory Y is if that is true and theory X is not, then what an organization can do is look at how to design their company. So decentralization and delegation comes up. If you decentralize control, that means you're not making all of the decisions from one office space or one person making all of the decisions. Decentralized means that decisions can be made at various levels of the organization, and a lot of different employees have the authority to do that. The authority comes from delegation. If I give the authority to someone to do a particular task, I have delegated my role to them, and they can work under my authority to do it. If you don't believe that your people are capable of doing anything without having someone look over their shoulder, delegation doesn't work. And if you have a system where you don't delegate, that means only a handful of people will have a huge commitment to an awful lot of work, and that's going to burn them out very quickly. If you're a manager, you need to delegate to your employees. That's kind of the whole nature of modern management. Job enlargement is something that companies can do to make the jobs more interesting. So you give more variety, more tasks within the job scope. It doesn't have to be an entirely different job, but it's just something to spice up the job a little bit and allow them the opportunity to try to do something that they don't ordinarily do that's within the scope of their position. Participative management simply means that employees are involved in decision making. If you remember in Chapter 9, we talked about the authoritarian management. Authoritarian management is probably going to make a lot of the theory X assumptions. Participative management is going to be more on the democratic side or the participative side of management, not necessarily the free rein. Free rein, you'd be giving all of the authority to your staff. But in participative management, it's more of that democratic management style where you're asking your employees, who oftentimes know more about the work that's being done since they're the ones who are doing it, than management does. Performance appraisals are important as well. So you give the employees objectives at the beginning of the year, you check in with them on a regular basis, and then you have them do their own self-evaluation. And at the end of the year, you give them an appraisal. And then, if it's something that is really good that they've been doing, then you can go towards the reinforcement theories that we were talking about, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, however it may fit the situation depending on how the performance review came out. Theory Z is the one that William Ochi came up with, and it combines some Western and Eastern meaning Asia, mostly China, Japan, Korea, in terms of management styles. So the whole idea is that we want to reduce employee turnover, increase commitment. By increasing commitment, you will reduce turnover. People won't quit as much if they're committed to the job. You'll improve morale and job satisfaction, which in turn should increase productivity as well. Turnover is a problem. If you hire people and 50% of your staff keeps quitting every year, then you're going to have to spend time going through resumes, hiring people, interviewing people, bringing them in, training them up, only to watch them leave again. And there's a huge expense associated with that. If you hire good people, they're committed to the organization, they're happy to be there, they're satisfied with the job, they're producing well, you don't want them to leave. So if you manage them correctly, they'll find the job engaging, they'll find themselves feeling respected, and they'll stick around. So you can cut costs as an end result of that. Theory Z can be reinforced by a strong company philosophy and culture. As I said in Chapter 9, if you have a strong culture, it makes management a lot easier. So if you have a strong culture that really reinforces the Theory Z tenets, then staff development and employment and other things can really help them stick around and avoid employee turnover. Involving them in decisions, empowering them to make decisions and have input, having generalist employees who can do a lot of different things to keep them satisfied so they don't get bored in a particular job. You can do that through the job enlargement that we were talking about. And as long as the company has a culture where they're worried about their workers, they're concerned about their workers, they view them as partners again, as opposed to simply people that are picking up a paycheck, you'll have a more satisfied workforce as a result. The limitations to Theory Z are that it can be difficult for people to come and make those types of commitments. A lot of times your life interrupts your ability to do work. A lot of people in their middle age, they've got older parents that they may need to take care of, and they may have children that they also need to take care of. Real world stuff starts to potentially implicate itself in how companies are run. Participative decision making is not always feasible or successful if you don't have a good plan for it, or if your staff is simply not prepared or educated or has the skill set to make decision making input. It may not always happen. And as we discussed earlier, if you have a critical decision that needs to happen fast, that's where your authoritarian management kind of kicks in. So a lot of places will involve themselves in anticipative decision making when it's appropriate, but sometimes you need to maybe make a decision a lot quicker. You also need to let your staff know that that might be the situation, because if you make a decision without including them and they had the expectation that they would, then they'll be disappointed. But if they know that we'll take your input whenever it's appropriate, but sometimes we need to make a judgment call, they should be okay with that because it won't violate their expectations. Strategies for motivating employees include the job characteristics theory. A couple of people back in '76, Oldman and Hackman, came up with some categories for characteristics that they think managers should keep in mind while they're designing jobs. The characteristics should help satisfy the psychological states, going back to Maslow's pyramid. And when the psychological states are satisfied, hopefully they'll be more satisfied with the job. And if you're more satisfied and committed to the job, you're not going to call in sick, you're not going to take breaks, you're not going to come in late, and you're not going to quit your job eventually. People who are dissatisfied with their job usually try to avoid working to any degree possible. They'll do the bare minimum when they're in the office, but I've actually had people that didn't like the job that they were in. They took the wrong job. They had a different major and they took a job just because they needed one. They weren't particularly happy in the job. And every week or 2 weeks when they get their time, they get some vacation time or personal time or sick time. And the minute they got enough sick time in their bank, they'd call in and say, "Oh, I don't feel good today. I'm not coming in." And they'd burn their vacation the minute they got it. You can almost go through your staff and find out the people with the least amount of time in their vacation or personal time off bank are maybe the ones that are the least satisfied. The ones who are the most satisfied don't necessarily need to burn their vacation time all the time because they enjoy work. The characteristics and psychological states, there are 5 core job characteristics. You want to make sure you have skill variety to keep your staff interested in what they're doing and reduce boredom. Task identity, you want to make sure that they understand what the task is and they can relate to it. They need to understand how important their task is and how it fits in with the needs of what the company's trying to accomplish. If you're doing something and it doesn't make any sense to you and you don't see how it fits into the bigger picture, why are you doing it? So if you understand how significant your task is, you're putting the wheels on the car because it won't roll without them. That's an obvious example, but sometimes it's a little bit more ambiguous and people need to understand what they're doing in furtherance of the organization's mission. To the extent that you can, provide some autonomy, delegate authority to them, let them make their own decisions. We had employees who were doing customer service and taxes, and we had a lot of people asking for tax abatements because the law changed. We had several thousand people contacting us, so we knew it was going to be difficult if every abatement request had to go through a manager. So we came up with a cap after looking at some data, and we said that for everybody under $500, the staff could make that decision as to whether or not to approve the abatement themselves. Anything over 500 had to go to a manager. That provides some level of autonomy, but not complete autonomy, because if they wanted $500,000, you want someone probably at a higher level taking a look at it. You also want to make sure you give your employees good, valuable feedback, and it has to be timely feedback. Good, bad, or however you want to play it out. Reinforcement, etc., can fall into this category as well. The psychological states include experiencing meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of the results. So if you go through all the other factors, the end results are going to be a change in your psychological portfolio in your head. If you know what your task significance is and you've done some good work and you get some feedback, then it seems like what you're doing is meaningful. And if it's meaningful, it's going to motivate you to want to continue to do it. Same thing with experiencing responsibility. If you have a sense of responsibility, they gave you a job to do, you're responsible for it, you did it, and it was done well, then you can sit back and say, pat yourself on the back and have a good feeling about it. And also knowing about the results is important, and you get that through the feedback routine as well. So when you have the core job characteristics and the psychological states, we hope to have a few positive outcomes. People are satisfied with the job, they're motivated to keep working on the job, and they cut down on absenteeism and turnover, which can reduce costs to the company. When you're designing jobs, it's important to have a few things in mind. Sometimes, especially in manufacturing jobs, you could have a job that's very, for lack of a better word, boring. You could just be doing the same 3 things over and over again, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 12 months a year. It can be kind of boring over time. So job rotation, somewhat similar to job enlargement. Rather than expanding the duties of a particular person in their current job, what you would do is you would take them from their job and put them in a different job. And other people who are in the job that they're replacing would go back to their job, for example. So if you're in a manufacturing line and you're putting the tires on the car and somebody else is putting the radiators in, after putting on 10 or 15,000 tires, you might be kind of tired with it. no pun intended, and you can move them over to installing the radiators or the windows or whatever. And different people can then have 3 weeks or 3 months on a different job, and then they rotate back to another job. This has dual benefits because the employees get to learn more things. They feel more valuable because they're being entrusted to do this. They are also able to vary up their routines so that they don't necessarily get bored on the job. It's good for the employer too, because if you have people that know how to do different jobs and somebody calls in sick and you've already been rotated through other cycles and we have enough people where you work, I can ask you to go over to some other place for a couple of days until that person comes back. So having more skills, having cross training involved, it can be good for both sides. I already talked about job enlargement. So that's basically giving a little bit more authority in their work, giving them more tasks, letting them figure out how to do their job. This is their current job as opposed to job rotation, which is changing their job. There are intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. We'll talk about that a little bit further, but intrinsic is from inside and extrinsic is from outside. The sense of a job well done and the pride that you feel in your work, that's an intrinsic reward that you get. An extrinsic reward is when your boss tells you you did a good job or you qualify for a bonus because of the work that you were doing. Job enrichment is giving more of the control and delegating more of the authority of the work and tasks that are being done so that they can have more of a sense of engagement and ownership of their career. When people are engaged in their career instead of simply being told what to do and they can help figure out what they're supposed to be doing, it's more rewarding in the long run. So goal setting is important because it does a few things. When you establish something as a goal, those are the only things that you should be working on. So it can narrow the work that people are doing only to things that are related to the goal. If you have goals and people identify what needs to be accomplished, and it's not an impossible goal, it's a challenging goal, it's not an easy goal, it's something that people would be interested in trying to do, that can increase your effort. If you know that there's a goal that you're trying to accomplish, I want to run a marathon. I'm never going to run a marathon for the record, but if I wanted to run a marathon, I would have to go and have some goals. I'd have to run a mile, then I'd have to run 6 miles, then I'd have to run a half marathon. Knowing that I'm getting closer to the objective can help me continue and persist in trying to achieve that. So the same thing applies to the job. Cognition is basically how you think about things. So if you have a goal, it can change your behavior because thinking about the goal that you're trying to achieve, you can adapt your behavior through a rational process in order to achieve it. When giving feedback, managers need to make sure that positive context exists and constructive and positive language is used. Positive reinforcement typically is more effective than negative reinforcement, especially if your boss only gives you negative reinforcement. You never hear about anything that you do right, you only hear about the things you do wrong. Even if you do something wrong, if you can put a positive spin on it while focusing on the fact that it was something that was not supposed to be done, that's a more positive way to look at it. It's a more effective way of getting the message across so that people will actually respond in a manner that you want them to. If you only have negative feedback, people sometimes take that as a personal insult, they become offended, and if it becomes personal, then it's not going to be conducive to performing on the job. There'll be personal arguments, they'll be getting off point, they won't be focusing on the job at hand, they'll be saying, why does my boss not like me? You should be focusing on behaviors and strategies, and the feedback should be tailored to the needs of the individual worker. You have to be careful about that because you want to treat people fairly, but you have to know that certain people are going to be motivated by certain things and other people will be motivated by different things. So, to the extent possible, without collectively treating them differently, you need to understand that all the people are different and the way that you approach things may not work for everybody. Feedback should be a two-way communication process. If you're complaining about something because somebody didn't do their job, you have to be willing to listen to them as to why. They may not have been able to complete the job because they didn't have the proper tools, or they didn't get enough time, or they had to report to a different boss that day. Sometimes you may even find out that the reason that they're not able to come to the office on time is because there's a problem at home. Someone is sick, someone is in an abusive relationship. There's a lot of information that goes into assessing someone, and you need to know the context of the performance. And by having a two-way communication process, you won't be ignoring anything that should otherwise could potentially be an important part of the situation. There are limits to setting goals. You have to make sure you set the right goals. But having production targets can encourage workers to meet the targets. You always have to be worried about the law of unintended consequences. If you're going to reward people for certain behavior and you don't reward them for other behavior that is expected, they may ignore the behavior that they're supposed to be doing and only focus on what they're being rewarded for. There's a famous story that's probably not true, but in India in the 1800s, when Britain was a colonizer of India, there was a problem with cobras. They have a lot of poisonous snakes. So what they did is they came up with the bright idea to provide an incentive. Their goal was to eliminate snakes and decrease the amount of danger that people would face. So they told people that if they went out and hunted these snakes and killed them, they would come back and be rewarded a bounty. We'd pay you a couple of bucks every time you came in with a snake. What ended up happening, you understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to reduce the number of snakes, but by creating that incentive, it kind of had a perverse result because what ended up happening was people started breeding snakes so that they could kill them and then take them in and make a little bit easier money. When the British found out about that, they stopped the program, and then the people who'd been breeding the snakes let them go, and now the place had more snakes than they did before you started. If you're going to reward people for meeting a goal by building something in a certain period of time or bringing in enough money, they may start taking shortcuts and they may start going into some ethical issues that could be a problem. Famously, a few years ago at Wells Fargo, employees created millions of fake bank accounts because they were told that they had to sell a certain quota of accounts. So when somebody came in and they gave them the information, they'd open one account and then they'd use that same person to open 3 or 4 more accounts so that their numbers would look better and they'd get a bonus. It's also possible that goal setting can hamper achievement because the individuals become preoccupied with meeting the goals instead of doing what they're supposed to be doing. So, like I said, if you're rewarding only a piece of what's going on, they may lose the focus on the overall efforts of the job because the job usually requires multiple things to be happening. And if you pick a goal, we want to increase our productivity this year, you have to look at all of the things that go into increasing productivity. That's going to cover this chapter. Next time, we're going to do chapter 11, teamwork and communication.